Hello, Karelian kids and milk without lids. My name is Gonilok, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to my Goosey guide to Finnish death metal. Some of you may recall that in my original bastardized history of death metal video, I claimed that Sweden has Moomins. I knew that the Moomins originated in Finland, but given that they still have such a strong cultural presence in Sweden, I figured that it was an acceptable parallel to draw to the Muppets here in the United States. I was not correct. I have received many a threatening letter from Finnish people from all around the country of Finland, but I never really felt the need to address it. That is, until Moomin Troll himself came a knocking on my door in the wee hours of the morning, begging for reparations after I disgustingly misrepresented his entire family. Reparations, perhaps, in the form of this comprehensive and realistically untrustworthy historical breakdown of death metal in Finland. You know, after saying that out loud, I'm pretty sure Moomin Troll was just asking for money, but I guess it's too late for that now, you plump little hippopotamus-looking bastard, because I'm already talking about Finnish thrash metal. That's right. I can say thrash is trash as much as I'd like, but at the end of the day, pretty much every death metal scene in the world is built on the bones of an even older thrash metal scene. Unfortunately for Finland, their thrash metal was pretty unremarkable. Not a lot of bands, and not a lot of quality. In fact, the only bands that I'm even going to name drop as worthwhile are Stone, who released 2 decent thrash albums in the late 80s, and Cryptic, who released a pencil drawing of some hideous man with no teeth on his lower jaw. The drawing in question was accompanied by 4 competent thrash songs as well. But make no mistake, my intention here is not to build up the old-school Finnish thrash scene into something that it wasn't, nor is my intention to trick you into thinking that good thrash metal exists outside of Germany or Brazil. My intention is merely to demonstrate that extreme metal, and really metal in general, was not a foreign concept that suddenly burst out of the ground in 1990 like that charming gentleman on the Convulse demo. There was tape trading, and there were live performances domestically, but for the most part, the concept of death metal was sneakily swiped from Sweden. You see, whenever Sweden tries a cultural experiment, Finland tries it too. It doesn't matter if it was a catastrophic disaster that nobody enjoyed when Sweden did it, Finland is just that eager to be like their big, strong, meatball-chomping brothers to the west. That's the natural cycle of society. Sweden is copied by Finland is copied by Estonia, and Estonia is what I would imagine hell is modeled after. Sweden was making what we now consider to be death metal as early as 1988, and it was through tape trading and tape sharing and tape chewing that punks and other fans of heffy music got their long, greasy fingers on it. It was those same long, greasy fingers that then began to imitate the sound and, pretty quickly, develop a reasonably distinct Finnish death metal trademark. Ladies and gentlemen, creeps and crawlies, welcome to what could be referred to as the first wave of Finnish death metal, lasting from 1989 to 1996, more or less. It's never easy to pinpoint the definitive first release in a genre, but with that being said, we're all adults here, and I hope that you can respect, for the sake of this Goosey guide, right here and right now, I'm going to take the initiative and say that Funebre's Cranial Torment demo was Findeath's breathtaking debut performance. Cranial Torment is a phenomenal tape, featuring grisly gutturals, gangly guitars, and giggling gongs, which is an elaborate way of saying that the production is hot garbage and that the music itself is energetic. But let me be clear. When I say hot garbage, I mean that classic death metal hot garbage, the good hot garbage, the crunchy, lo-fi, sloppy sound that adds so much character, so much charm. If the rumors are to be believed, then the original tape run of Cranial Torment was literally oozing with crusty, room-temperature charm slime. That's how much charm Funebre was able to incorporate on their debut. But as charming as it was, it's not the best example for Finnish death metal overall. You see, Cranial Torment and a few other early Finnish demos were very bouncy and energetic and fun. I would not go nearly as far as to call it happy, but this particular flavor of death metal certainly had a spirit of its own. So, was this the fate to befall our friends in Finland? While the United States was pumping out evil death metal, and Sweden was brewing up some punky death metal, was Finland going to make bouncy death metal? If you said yes, you are wrong. The Finnish scene very quickly did a 180 of sorts and began to incorporate haunting melodies and a drop-dead gorgeous sense of melancholy. A distinct bittersweetness that feels as though it is reflecting on death rather than dreading it. This is best exemplified by Abhorrence and Sentenced when it comes to death metal, but Finnish culture has always had a certain mournful characteristic to it. And I mean really. Can you blame them? Back in the 19th century, a now famous composer named Jean Sibelius went crazy bones on his compositions and helped to solidify a common identity for his country through his music, notably through pieces that took influence from and were meant to accompany the Kalevala. The Kalevala is the national epic of Finland, a saucy little rendezvous between giants and warriors and dogs, ripe with suicide and drenched in incest. But most importantly, the Kalevala is tragic and morbid, and Jean Sibelius was one of the first people to translate that specific morbidity to the medium of music. This patent-pending poignance manifested itself most notably in the lovingly patriotic Karelian Isthmus by Amorphis, but it's audible in the bulk of Finnish death metal, and especially the early stuff. But hold your horses, lads and lasses! Let's get back to incest for a second. Finland has been globalizing itself in recent years, but in the early 90s they were fairly isolated in terms of their culture. So, when it came time to blossom their beautiful bouquet of brutality, there wasn't a lot of influence to draw from. There was the Swedish death metal scene, of course, and Darkthrone did actually come over for a playdate in Riihimäki back when the band still played death metal, see the Soulside Journey era. But once the foundation was set for Finnish death metal, the easiest thing for musicians to do was simply draw influence from the musicians around them. Convulse was making out with Amorphis, Pertinence was smooching with Lubricant, Yzma was writing love letters to Rippikoulu, and all that is part of why the Finnish style, so to speak, is so consistent between the early bands. Their lips were on the lips of one another. And now that we've set this saliva-swapping, incestuous stage, let's talk a bit more about the bands themselves. A band named Phlegethon released their Visio Dei Beatifica demo in 1989, which mirrored the earliest death metal releases in other countries in the sense that it was really a death thrash fusion. 1989 is also when Funebra released Cranial Torment, as we talked about earlier, and also when Yzma premiered Swarming of the Maggots, a much less successful predecessor to March of the Penguins. But it was 1990 when Sicko Mode was truly engaged, and the classics began flowing like honey in the summer sunlight from then until roughly 1995 or 1996. Sentenced blessed the world with When Death Joins Us, a more straightforward version of what would eventually be the melodic death metal that everybody and their mother is currently raving about. Pestigore released a bunch of grimy, slimy demos in the early 90s, and Depravity released 20 minutes of white noise in 1993, fittingly titled Silence of the Centuries. Disgrace came out with their Beyond the Immortalized Existence demo, and Unholy released the Procession of Black Doom, which represented a new node on the stem of Finnish death metal that would later branch off into full-on death doom, accompanied of course by Rippikoulu as they dug out their niche together, as friends. Speaking of friends, a friendly reminder at this point in the video that I personally do not speak this disgusting soup language called Finnish, and that many of my pronunciations are probably pretty wild and wacky. Hopefully the information is still clear, but if it's not, hey, you know who to blame. Once the demos were out and about and truly making their rounds, Finnish death metal was already in fashion, and hey, we haven't even gotten to the full lengths yet. There were so many interesting and now super influential records making their debut. There was Convulse's World Without Frogs, Sentenced's Shadows of the Past, Demigod's Slumber of Swollen Thighs, Amorphis's The Karelian Isthmus, and Godforsaken's doomy deathfest titled The Dismal Gleams of Desolation. I'd also like to throw out the name Protected Illusion for those of you sweet peas that like the thrashy stuff. Festering Fairy Tales is the name of the full-length, and ooh mama, it is a doozy. Since metal is so fond of grouping bands into 3s or 4s, let's take this time to discuss the Nokia Trio. At least, that's what the drunken Finnish man called the group when he relayed this information to me from his bathtub at 4 in the morning. This trio consists of Convulse, Pertinence, and Lubricant, 3 different death metal powerhouses that operated out of the city of Nokia. In spite of the ceaseless frenzied incest going on within the scene, each band served as a figurehead for a notably different approach to death metal. Convulse was brutal and extremely percussive, but all the while distinctly Finnish. Moose the mamas, if you will. Pertinence got a little weird with their music, culminating in Member of Immortal Damnation, but they still stayed within the confines of traditional death metal expectations. And then there was Lubricant, a bunch of wacky medical-minded weirdos that weren't afraid to experiment with the formula. At the time they were dismissed as Carcass ripoffs, but a lot of Finnish bands were dismissed as ripoffs of something when they first premiered. Now, weird can mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask, but Lubricant was far from the only bizarre and innovative act operating out of the land of frozen meat pies in the early 90s. Who could forget Demilich, switching up the time signatures and vocal styles to tell some truly eye-catching and instructive tales of decomposition. As far as I'm aware, they're also one of the first bands with a vocalist that sounds like he's constantly burping. Perhaps even weirder was Fun Cunt, who, in the classic Finnish death metal style, released a couple of demos and ran for the hills. Their demo, is a hearty mixture of various riffing styles sewn together into 2 long songs, with occasional but unforgettable surprise saxophone bits. I think there's also some violin and piano as well, and it never really feels like a natural progression. It's just bing, bang, boom, we're doing this now, try to keep up. Adramelech's Spring of Recovery and eventual full-length Psychostasia are kinda wacky too, but wowee are they splendid. If we're still talking about the 1990s, which, we are, then it's worth mentioning Finnish black metal as well. Black metal and death metal have always been good buddies, but in Finland specifically, the 2 styles grew up attached at the hip. The labels black and death weren't as universal at the time, and the musicians were more concerned with making cool and nice music than they were with meeting specific genre expectations. This is why Finnish black metal is often so death metal leaning, bordering on and crossing into what some call war metal, or bestial black metal. Look no further than Beherit's 7th Blasphemy, or Archgoat's Jesus Spawn demo for proof of this. But hey, if you want that good Finn Black, look a little later in their discographies. Perhaps Drawing Down the Moon and Heavenly Vulva, respectively, It's up to you what you listen to, but my recommendations are on the table if you want them. As I touched on a bit earlier, it was around 1995 when things really started to slow down, but that's not to say that there weren't some killer kiddos coming out of the ground. There was still Nomacon's The Me, Sarnoth's Northodox, which is a death-doomed delight, and Paroxysm's Selected Works, which was a promo tape, certainly for fans of the more experimental stuff. But after that is when the inevitable happened. Hard times came to Moominland. A famine swept over the land, and all the good bands that were bouncing and bopping to the beat either gave up or changed for the worse. That's a personal opinion, of course, but the overall spirit absolutely took a hit. Pertinence, Convulse, Demilich, Fun Cunt, and Funabred dropped everything and sprinted gently into the night on the tips of their toes without so much as a goodbye. Many of those bands have still not released any new material to this day. Amorphis and Sentenced kept at it, but they both moved into synth-heavy type death metal, with Amorphis actually forgoing the death elements altogether at one point. People like to talk about death metal fading into obscurity at some point in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is somewhat true, but it's also extremely hyperbolic. There are still dozens and dozens of killer outfits that debuted in the early 2000s, but in the case of Finland, it's kinda true. If you wanted extreme music in Finland in the early 2000s, you were either listening to the old stuff and wishing you were older, or you were following punk and or melodic death metal. And the undisputed king of the latter was Children of Bodom, unless you dispute that, in which case it would be the disputed king of the latter, but either way, Children of Bodom was the king of something. They were super popular and super influenced by death metal, and yet they were a very far cry from the tasteful balance between abrasiveness and gentle melody that the titans of old once utilized. The closest thing to an immediate continuation of the early 90s was the groove metal-infused style offered by Torture Killer and Sota Jumala, but I have been told that these bands did not sit well with the quote-unquote true death metalers. That being said, when you consider that Torture Killer originally began as a 6 Feet Under cover band, and then you consider how bands like 6 Feet Under were received in other parts of the world, such as My House, then I suppose it's not that far-fetched. Groovy death metal is one thing, but when it gets too bare bones and even Pantera derivative, that's when people tend to get alienated, and aliens give me the creeps. The times had clearly changed, and an entirely different breed of metal was tapping its toes from the womb up to the moon. This particular evolution of music has inspired fans worldwide, but it's not the style that I want to emphasize in this video. The style of old was exactly that by this point in time. Old. And crusty. And gross. That's when Sluggathor crawled out of Finland's immaculate waste management system and triumphantly declared, "Children of Bodom, more like children of boredom." Sluggathor whipped out the old 1-2 punch with their double dose of demos in the year 2000, but in 2003 they delivered the death blow and they unleashed the Sluggathron. Sluggathor did not give a hoot or a holler about the evolution of the scene, and they came out swinging with their groovy, rough and tough brutal death metal. Well, that all sounds pretty good to me. Could it be? Were the days of good death metal back upon us? Not quite. I mean, you had Death Chain pumping out some tastefully performed death thrash madness with Dead Meat Disciples and Death Thrash Assault, and at the same time, Swallowed's Epitaph of Nauseation in 2008 went back to the old school Death Doom style, but these individual incantations of resuscitation took a bit of time to make a larger impact on the overall scene. The revivalists came, slowly but surely, and over time more and more bands bent over to pick up the torch that the old gods forgot to pass on, and here we really begin to see some modern favorites crop up. Albums including Vorum's Grim Death Awaits, Corpsessed Abysmal Thresholds, Crip's progressive political essay on ending segregation, Decaying's Encirclement, Solithis's Summoned from the Void, etc., etc., etc. By the early 2010s, the momentum had added up, and now there were underground labels keen on signing new bands, and releasing vinyl reissues of the classics from the early 90s. And while all of this is of course underground, that doesn't mean that it was a secret, especially since we're now talking about the age of social media. At this point, several key bands that had gone into hiding decided to return to the sunlight, and those that had moved on already began warming up to the idea of returning to the old school style. Demigod, for instance, continued making music up until 2007, but in 2012 announced that they would begin playing the Slumber of Sullen Eyes in full for their live shows. That's pretty sicko mode if you ask me, Holmes. In 2015, the Finnish Death Metal Maniacs Festival really solidified the return to the death metal focus, offering new death metal bands a humongous opportunity for exposure and networking, and all the while giving old death metal bands a platform to reintegrate themselves into the culture. You had Convulse, Depravity, Pestigore, Pertinence, Lubricant, and Demilich all in one smile-inducing barrel of laughs, but you also had Lantern, Solithus, Cemetery Fog, Decaying, and Cadaveric Incubator to represent the baby generation. Goo goo gaga. There is no singular Big Bang event that brought Finland back into a golden age of extremity, but the Finnish Death Metal Maniacs Fest was still a massive part of it. And that's about where we are today. It's not the same as it once was, but culture rarely is. You don't want the music to stagnate and sound exactly the same as it did the last time around. That's how you end up with thrash metal. You want some healthy innovation and experimentation mixed in with that old school worship. At least I do. Now, before I go, I realize that I threw out an awful lot of names and releases in this video, and I understand that not everybody's going to want to take the time to plod through everything step by step and toe by toe, so I'll finish off the video with a list of my personal favorites from the Finnish scene. It goes a little something like this. A 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3. Sentenced, Journey to Pohjola. Convulse, World Without God. Adramelech, Psychostasia. Sluggathor, Echoes from Beneath. Amputory, Ode to Gore. Arsbo, hey baby. Demilich, The Four Instructive Tales, ... of Decomposition. Ripikoulu, Musta Ceremonia. Solithus, No King Reigns Eternal. Shadows of Sunset, Fires of the Soon Dead Sun. Aspiration, Visions of Reality. Amorphis, Privilege of Evil. Phlegathon, Visio Dei Beatifica, remember that's a thrashy one, and finally Vorum, Grim Death Awaits, which is probably the best transition to modern production that I've found. It's fast, riffy, and to the point. And that's all I have for you tonight, my friends. I hope you've Wow. I hope you've enjoyed getting goosey with the Northerners this time around, because I sure didn't. Good night, everybody.